Hey book lovers, Callie here. Welcome back to the Enchanted Library, and this is my July wrap-up, and it also does include my Booktubeathon wrap-up as well. So there's a grand total of 13 books that I'm going to be talking about today. Holy crap. The first book that I ended up reading for July was one that I ended up giving a 4 out of 5 stars to because I absolutely adored it. I could not put it down, and that was The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. And this book honestly just kept a smile on my face the entire time. Michael is a new book boyfriend for me because he is absolutely amazing. This book is about a 30-year-old woman who has Asperger's, and her parents are getting on her constantly to get married, have a child, so then that way they can be grandparents, and the pressure, it's kind of getting to her, but she doesn't quite understand it. So she ends up hiring a male escort to help her because anytime that she has had sex in the past, she has not enjoyed it. So she thinks that a male escort is going to be the best way because Stella, who is our lead, she thinks in numbers, she thinks very logically about things. So in order to be better at something, you have to learn from someone who is the best at it. So who better than someone who has a lot of practice? But honestly, this book is about a lot more than that. It really delves into the relationship between the two of them, and it is such a sweet, sweet story, and I will say it is a romance book, so if you are younger, probably don't read this, but if you think you're mature enough for the content, definitely pick this up because it was amazing. I just hope that I can someday find my Michael. And I know from the synopsis that I just said that I hope that I could find a male escort, but that is not exactly what I mean. Read the book and you'll understand. And after a contemporary romance, I had to completely switch things up, and I ended up going with a YA fantasy. So that is Ash Princess by Sebastian. This book I ended up giving about a 3.5 stars to, but I'm definitely going to be continuing on with the series because I just see so much potential with this. This book follows a girl whose family was sort of taken over by a Kaiser, and she was princess, her mother was the queen, who was murdered in front of her eyes, and since then she has had to live with the enemy as this sort of totem of mockery, and any time that rebellion started to happen, she would be sort of tortured and kind of becoming a martyr. But in that time as well, because she grew up for like the last 10 years with these people, she's sort of become one of them. She's friends with the girl whose father killed her mother in front of her, and it's such a mind, it really messes with your mind. It shows a lot about how things mess with your brain, and how even though she claims to be friends with these people, there is still an underlying hint of rebellion within her that she's just waiting to let go, because this whole time she's hoping for the rebellion to come and save her, but it's been 10 years, so what is she to do? She can't really do much on her own. She's made a fool in front of so many people, so many of her people, until there is an infiltration into the palace to help free her, and then that just sets the rebellion on fire, and I'm so happy with this. There is magic involved, there is subterfuge, but the best thing is that the Ash Princess uses her brain, and I really, really love that. The next book I picked up kind of didn't hit the mark for me. I don't read many thrillers, but when I do, I want to be invested. But this book just fell way, way short. I picked it up early last year because my friend and I, we were going to read it together, but I finally got around to it, and I'm just glad that it's over. I ended up reading The Woman in Cabin 10 by Ruth Ware, and I have heard hit or miss with her stories. This is the first one that I've ever read of hers, and I don't know if I'm really going to go out of my way to try again. This story, I gave it a 2 stars. It was very repetitive. I didn't really think that a lot of thought was put into the actual thriller aspect of it, to the murder. Even when the murder happened, I remember thinking, okay, still not exciting yet, still not enthralled. And I couldn't connect with the main character. I swear her liver was going to give out at any moment because all she did was drink. I don't know how she's supposed to do her job when she's drunk all the time. I mean, hello, you're not Sherlock. You can't be high all the time and then still think that you can get the job done. That is solely alone for Sherlock. But I just did not like the main character. I can't even be bothered to look up her name because I don't recall it. And I just really did not like this book, unfortunately. It didn't catch me off guard, it didn't surprise me. I was just basically going through the motions to finish this book because I didn't want to DNF another book, because I've done like 2 now, and that's awful for me. So I don't know. I really was not invested in this book, and like I said, I don't think I'm going to pick up another Ruth Ware book for a while. But I'm still trying to find a thriller that is going to be really good. It's just very hard for me to either A, not see the plot twists coming, or B, find them super interesting, because they kind of try too hard. Thrillers try too hard. So, I don't know. I would rather read like a YA or a fantasy book that just happens to have a thriller aspect, and it's not the main purpose of the storyline. So I just don't think that this was a very good book for me, but I did read many good books this past month, so I can't be too salty about it. The next book was actually the Owl Crate book of the month, and that was My Plain Jane by the Lady Janies. And this book was honestly a pleasant surprise, because when I initially had heard about this book a little earlier this year, I thought that I knew what it was, but I did not have any idea how deep they were going to go. So this story is a retelling of Jane Eyre, where Jane is a student at a all-girls boarding school, basically, but Jane has a secret, and that is that she can see and speak to ghosts. The other characters in this, where we also get their point of views, is from Charlotte, which is, yes, Charlotte Bronte. She is best friends with Jane, and she ends up wanting to write a story about her friend's life. And then there is Alexander, and he is a ghost hunter. So Alexander and Jane get thrown together in an odd series of events where she is in the same place that he is currently catching a ghost, and he can sort of sense that she knows what's going on, even though she's trying to keep it a secret, and she's kept it a secret her entire life, because that could mean bad news bears for her. So in this time where Jane is trying to basically suppress the fact that she can see and speak to ghosts, she ends up becoming a governess, and that is at Thornfield Hall. And if you know Jane Eyre at all, you know that Thornfield Hall is also where the dubious Mr. Rochester lives. And you know what? I love the twist that they put on Mr. Rochester in this book, because it just makes a lot more sense. Because if you've read Jane Eyre, if you're a modern person, I should say, who's read Jane Eyre, you can probably sense some themes with Mr. Rochester, and they definitely do touch on that, but they also open up the whole world a whole lot more, because there's this whole society that fights ghosts, and it's really interesting. It was really fun. The only thing that I did not like about this book was the romance, because 2 people that I thought were perfect for each other, that I wanted to get together, ended up not, and 2 people who I didn't see it, I couldn't get my head to wrap around it, ended up together, and I still don't get it. It still doesn't make sense to me, but I mean, it's a good way to, I don't know, flip the switch on things and what to anticipate, but I don't know. That's the only thing that kind of was a flat note for me in this book. But other than that, it was a really fun ride, and I really loved the world. The next book that I read was a historical fiction, and honestly, I think it became an instant classic for me, because I was absolutely enchanted from start to finish while reading this book. And that is The Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Pie Society by Mary Ann Shaffer and Anne Barrows, who are coincidentally niece and aunt. This story is written entirely in letter format, or in correspondence format, because there are also some telegrams that are included. There are no chapters. There is no traditional method in telling the story with this book, but I absolutely loved it. It follows Juliet Ashton, and she is an author, and while World War II was happening, she was writing stories to help alleviate the stress and bring some humor to the world, because obviously it was a very dark time. And when the war was over, she ends up getting a letter from this man who is part of a literary society on Guernsey Island, and he came across a book that had her name and address in it, and asking her to find him a copy of a book that he really wanted. The reason that he's doing this is because he has not left the island in a very long time. Once the Germans came and occupied Guernsey Island, they weren't allowed to leave, and now that it's been a couple years since they've been gone, he still doesn't really get out very much. But he absolutely loves reading, and the 2 of them end up striking up a correspondence with each other, and then this introduces her into the society. Within the society, there are many members, and you also get their letters and points of view, and they talk about their time during the occupation. So throughout this entire correspondence, Juliet is learning everything that she can about Guernsey Island, and she wants to write a story about this society, so she ends up traveling to Guernsey to visit them and learn more about them. In that time, so much happens. There's so many emotions. You learn so much about these people, and it's surprising how much you can learn just in written letters. So really, the best way that I could describe this book is enchanting, and I recently watched the movie too because it just came out, well actually I watched it yesterday because it just came out yesterday on Netflix, and while the film did make some big changes, I think they made it work for film well, because you couldn't really do necessarily the way that this was done on video. So I do like the film adaptation, and I do understand that they are two totally different things, however, and I like them both separately, but the overarching story on both of them is just lovely, and I think that so many people should read this book because it was beautiful. The next book that I finished, I will say, is probably going to spark up a bit of controversy, but I mean, this book is probably the book that has taken me the longest to read in my entire life. I started it in January or February this year, and I just finished it in July because I just really did not like it. And that's Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. Now, this book, I picked up this particular copy, I purchased it the year that it came out. So I've held on to this book for a very long time, and I had put off reading it because of all of the hype, because I thought that this would be right up my alley. I wanted to love it so, so much, because who wouldn't love a story about video games and 80s culture, and just the entire idea was just so fascinating to me. But the actual execution of it was awful. I ended up giving it a 1 star because I felt like every time I picked this up, it was just a chore to read. The only thing that I found interesting was the bit of 80s pop culture that I could sort of emulate with, because yes, I did play Zork back in the day, yes, I did watch those movies, yes, I do know a lot about those video games, but the way that it was portrayed in this book wasn't interesting. He ended up writing it more so like a tell as opposed to a show, but not in a good way. Like, he told you, this is how you play the game, this is how it happens, this is how you win, this is the life of this character. And I didn't get invested in the characters at all because I didn't feel like they actually had any arc, and I didn't feel like they had any depth, and it was just this kid playing a game. That's all I can really say about it. I could do a full in-depth rant about this, but I don't really want to because I know that so many people love this story. It just really wasn't for me, and honestly, I have to fault that to the writing style. It could have been a lot better than it was, and the characters could have had a lot more depth to them, but they didn't. I feel like the focus was placed mainly on dropping little hints of video games from the 80s and things like that. Like, there are paragraphs that just talk about the tech of like a Commodore. I'm like, I don't care about that. That's unfortunately where I'm going to end it with this book and move on to something better. So those are the books that I read traditionally for July, and now we're going to get into the Booktubeathon reads that I had. So this is going to go a little bit into August, but I think that it's just best to include them all together. So with the Booktubeathon this year, there were 7 challenges, as there always are, to sort of encompass the entire week, and that week I was very, very busy, and I did only end up reading 6. I was very close to reading the 7, but I just couldn't push myself that much. I was way too frazzled with that entire week. So I will get into the books that I did read and just give you my thoughts. Book number 1 satisfied 2 of the 7 challenges, which was to let a coin toss choose your first book, as well as to read a book about something that you want to do. And I took that fairly literally, so when I flipped the coin, I had choice between 2 books, obviously, and Girl Code by Cara, Alwill, Leyba ended up being the winner. And it was perfect because it was a shorter book, so it was great to kick off the Booktubeathon with, because I read it in a couple of hours and then I went to bed. So basically, this book I gave about a 3 stars. It is one that kind of hit home the fact that girl power within the vast world of entrepreneurship and just the business world in general is very important. How we shouldn't be catty to each other, how we should just be empowering each other to do the best that we can do, and I really love the message that that put across, which is something honestly that any decent person knows, that you shouldn't put people down, you should be positive and helpful and just really embrace who you are and helping others, and it's just being a good person. So I like that she really hit that home with this book, and even though it wasn't a new lesson for me, it's nice to see fresh eyes repeating it in a really fun and inventive way. Another thing that this book had in it was interviews with other female entrepreneurs, and it was really nice to get an insight into their lives, what they're really interested in, and how their businesses came to life. So I really did enjoy this book. I think it's a fun book for anybody really to read at any age, because it doesn't just talk about business, it just talks about being a good person in general, not being catty, and just being, like I said, a good person. So I really liked this book, and I am glad that I read it. Book number 2, which I also read on day 1 of the Booktube-A-thon, satisfied the challenge of reading a book with a beautiful spine. And I don't know if you're actually going to be able to see it because of my lighting, but I ended up choosing The Waking Land by Callie Bates, and the spine, honestly, just absolutely beautiful. It's got the pure white background, and then you've got the green from her hair because it does come over from the cover, and it was just absolutely beautiful. So this book was probably one of the longest books that I had for my challenges, and I decided to read this on a day that I had off and I could basically just devote to finishing it. So I did finish it that day, and I really liked it. So this book I ended up giving a 3.5 to 3.75 stars on Goodreads, because there were a couple of things that took a little bit for me to fully comprehend and to get over. So this story is kind of similar to Ash Princess in the fact that a girl is taken hostage by a group who wants to rule everyone, pretty much. So someone who is considering himself the king, even though not everybody wants him to be the king. And her family was a part of the rebellion, so they end up taking her hostage for years and making her sort of a part of their group. The interesting twist, however, on this, where Ash Princess, she knew and she had that rebellion within her the entire time, but she had some friends within that group. In this, Alana, she ends up really empathizing with her captors, and I kind of suspect that it was meant to be a bit of Stockholm Syndrome, because she really believed in their politics. She really felt that they were in the right, even though they've been holding her hostage this entire time. That is until the king actually ends up being killed and she gets whisked away to her family. Now, the issue that Elena has is that she has magic within her that she has had to keep a secret throughout her time in court, and she ends up basically having it all explode out of her at once as she is fearful for her life, really confused about her feelings about her biological parents and how she felt when she was in court, and it really is a bit mind-bendy as well, kind of like how Ash Princess was. This story, however, really gets into the rebellion side of things, so building up the rebellion, figuring out how both sides can have spies, and just really getting into that. It also does touch on the secretiveness of the magic that ends up being portrayed, and there is a romance in here that I am all game for, and I'm really happy with, and I think I have another book boyfriend because this book just, yep, made it happen. I am very excited to continue on with this series. The next book is already out, and I know that the cover has a girl but with flames, so I'm very excited. The title is a little bit on the nose, and the way that the land wakes up is kind of interesting that that is being referenced in the title. If you read the book, you'll understand, but I just found that a little bit funny, I will admit. But once it was done and over with, I was just on board with everything else. So I'm excited to continue on with this series, and this was the second book that I read for Booktube-A-thon. The next book that I read was basically just a buffer book, so then that way I could get up to 7 books. It was one that I've been wanting to read for a while, and one of my most anticipated books of the year, and that was The Loneliest Girl in the Universe by Lauren James. This book follows the story of Romy, and she is the only girl on this spaceship because when the ship took off, it had all of its crew, it had her parents, but she was actually ended up being born in space, and that was against the rules. And in the time of her childhood, her parents both die, and also the entire crew is gone as well. So she has been left to fend for herself on her spaceship for years. And she's on her way to Earth 2 with basically a bunch of frozen embryos to repopulate the world and start fresh. The only communication that she does end up having, however, is with her therapist who is on Earth working for NASA. And she is basically the only person that she can talk to. And she gets sent podcasts and videos and things, so that way she kind of knows what people are like, but she hasn't met anyone other than her parents before, so it's a very different world for her. So while she is on the ship writing her fan fiction and just enjoying what she has of her life and dealing with her own forms of anxiety, she ends up getting a communication from another ship that is on its way to meet her. This is when she gets introduced to Jay, who is a boy around her age that she's obsessed with. We'll just say that. This book is a thriller, but one thing that I will say is that I was not thrilled by it. That was really cheesy, but it was the best way I can describe it because nothing really caught me by surprise. I really appreciated the fact that the main character had anxiety, but really the twist I called very early on, so that was very disappointing. So it's kind of along the lines of The Woman in Cabin 10, where this thriller just didn't catch me off guard. It wasn't really a surprise. I still had an entertaining time reading it, but I wasn't shocked or anything like that. I'm a little disappointed in that, but it was still interesting. It was still a fun read. It was a very quick read. It was the second day that I read this book of Booktube-A-thon, and I'm still happy that I read it, but it just didn't blow me away. And the third last is The Complete Works of Poetry by Tennyson, and this satisfied the challenges of wearing the same hat on your head the entire time while reading this book, and a book with a green cover. So this took me a couple of nights to read, so I wasn't able to read it as quickly as I could, and it's kind of hard for me to fully delve into this. I gave it a 3.5 stars. It was kind of average because it was very hit or miss depending on the poem that I was reading, if I was really invested or not. There were a couple that got me a bit emotional. If you watch my Booktube-A-thon vlog, you will see that I did end up crying a couple of times. But I also really love his long narrative poetry, like Lady of Shalott is one of my favorites, along with a couple of his shorter works. But there was also a whole section that I really couldn't read because they were dialect poems, and I couldn't even make out how to read the dialect. So it was very difficult to really get into that section. And then there were a couple of poems that I just really wasn't super on board with, but I did enjoy reading them overall. I am very interested in taking apart a few of his poems and fully delving into them, but I'm very happy that I did end up reading this. The next book, so second last book now, was a book that I ended up reading as an audiobook and satisfied the challenge of reading a book and then watching the film adaptation, and that was The Lost City of Zed by David Grann. So I read this on the drive to the cottage that I stayed at for the weekend of Booktube-A-thon, and I was absolutely fascinated with this story of Colonel Fawcett. So it follows his life pretty much from the moment that he meets his wife to the time that he goes missing, and it encompasses so much stuff. Like, it talks about the Royal Geographical Society, it talks about the members, it talks about major people in history who were super on board with Fawcett, who were affected by Fawcett. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle spoke with him and corresponded with him, and it was because of Colonel Fawcett that he came up with the Lost World. And I just absolutely find that completely astounding, the way that all of these people integrated, and how many people have had their lives affected by Colonel Fawcett and have also gone missing in search of him to figure out his story, to find the lost city of Zed. And it's heartbreaking, but also just amazing how that could happen. David Grann is actually a writer who came across the story of Colonel Fawcett in the early 90s and decided that he wanted to go after him and find out what happened. Obviously, in that time frame, Colonel Fawcett would have passed away even just from old age, but he still wanted to uncover the story. So he really delved into Colonel Fawcett's life. He spoke to his descendants and uncovered things at the Royal Geographical Society, reading passages and letters and diary entries, and he followed Colonel Fawcett's actual expedition. And it was just so interesting to me, and I feel like this is something that kids should learn in school, because it's really just fascinating. I keep saying that, but I can't describe it in any other way, because there is no sense of adventure in the way that it was back in the early 1900s. Like, we've seen the world, we know the world. There's no part of the world that has been not uncovered. But in the time that Colonel Fawcett was a member of the Geographical Society, he was plotting. Like, he was going to places that have never been witnessed before by the common man. And he was figuring all of this out and mapping, and it's just absolutely insane to me to think that. And I want to be an explorer. Like, if it was me back in that time, I would pray that I could be a part of that society, because even though it's like an all men's club, there's just so much interesting stuff that you could learn. I want to visit it. I want to go there, and I want to read his letters, and I've caught the bug. I've caught the bug. So I did end up watching the film adaptation that has Charlie Hunnam and Tom Holland in it. And honestly, Tom Holland was the best part of the entire film, because I don't know why the director and the writer of the movie didn't just follow this, because this book had me enthralled from moment one, whereas the movie, I was falling asleep during. Like, I was so bored. They changed facts about Fawcett's life that did not need to be changed. There was no reason for it, and he was so dull. Like, Fawcett was just this man who was on a mission. He knew what he wanted out of life, and he was going for it, and his passion was Zed. And the way that Charlie Hunnam portrayed him and the way that the director had him portray him was just boring. Like, he didn't want to find Zed. Like, he was just there on a mission. And I didn't like the way that that happened. So the book obviously is better than the film. Read it. I just think that it would be a very interesting read for a lot of people. And I guess the moment that I said the battery was dying, it decided to die. So let's talk about The Chrysalids by John Wyndham. I read this book in high school. It's been about 15 years since I read it, and I forgot a lot of what was in it. But I feel like if this book was released now as a dystopian novel, it was written in 1955, keep that in mind. But if this book had been written now and released with just a little less of the religion, I think it would be a big hit. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised that this was a book that they had us read, because I went to a Catholic high school. I had always gone to Catholic school, but this talks about the good and the bad of religion, and I don't know why it just surprised me that this was a book that they had chosen. I'm surprised this isn't a banned book, but I think that it got a really good message across, where not everyone who thinks that they're right on the word of religion is right. So the whole point that this world that this little guy named David lives in is that his family and his whole community feel like they know what man looked like before the apocalypse, basically. And anything that does not look like how it should is a deviation or a mutation and should be killed. So anybody who is a little bit different ends up hiding. So that is to the point of even like a little birthmark or an extra toe in the case of his friend Sophie. Like, they want to exterminate, so then that way they can continue living on in the way that they think that God was wanting man to look like. Or even to the point of their vegetation and their crops. If the crop was wrong in their mind, they would burn it. And it was honestly it was an interesting read for me. I ended up giving it about a 3 out of 5 stars, because it didn't totally blow me away, but it was still interesting, and I think it would be a hit nowadays. And I like that it followed the story of David, even as a kid, just learning about how the world is different, and his innocence of mind, to growing up and feeling that way and being a part of his group of friends who have their own version of a deviation, and how he lives with life that way. And also how, even though he thinks one way and his parents think another way, he has a friend in his uncle who tells him that not everywhere is the way that he lives. And I did really like this book, and I would recommend it, especially for kids nowadays, and particularly even if you are super religious. I think that you can still learn from this, because not everybody who is religious is bad. Like, there are people who have different points of views. I'm not going to get into a full discussion about this, but this book really touches on it, and I respect that it has the nerve to do that. And again, this was written in 1955, so I was really fascinated with the fact that it was written in this way, in that time, and had the foresight of being a post-apocalyptic story and touching on these very sensitive topics in an interesting way. And I'm really happy that I ended up rereading this book. I feel like I need a glass of water because I've been talking non-stop. I just filmed my July book haul before this, so I've just been chatting for like the last hour and a half. And that was a lot of books to go through. So I would actually love to hear your thoughts on these books. If you have read them, if you want to read them, if they interest you, and what your thoughts and opinions are. Because I read a lot of books, there's still a lot more that I could talk about in relation to these books. If you want to see me go in depth about any of these more and doing a book talk, kind of like how I did with Onyx and Ivory, I would definitely be game to do that. Just let me know if there's one of these books that you would like to hear more about. And with all that being said, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content. I put out new videos every weekend with some bonus videos here and there. And I guess until next time, keep reading.